Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to introduce Randy very quickly. Randy Flood is a historian and co-founder with Robert Schroeder of the Real American Revolution, a nonprofit organization established to educate citizens about the American Revolution. Professionally, Randy began his career by serving on the staff of the United States Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works during the environmental decade of the 70s, when most of our nation's environmental laws were enacted. While in Washington, D.C., Randy taught federal government courses on the legislative and budget processes as an adjunct faculty at George Washington University, and was also a frequent guest lecturer at numerous colleges and universities, trade associations, business and labor meetings, and conferences. Currently, he resides in Williamsburg, Virginia, where he's working on a comprehensive plan to educate teachers and museum personnel about the American Revolution in preparation of celebrating the 250th anniversary. Congratulations on that, Randy. So, Randy, I'll give you the floor.
Well, thank you, Denny, and thanks to those of you who are joining us in the Zoom session today. This is the second in a series of French involvement in the American Revolution. I think we did the first one back in July of last year. But at the outset, I have some very exciting news for all of you. I'm currently involved in a partnership with the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association to provide materials, primary resources, all sorts of materials to social studies teachers throughout Virginia, to help them not only educate students and their communities about the American Revolution in general, but specifically to talk about the trail and its impact on the route to Yorktown. So it's very exciting, and all of us are very excited about this project. It's one of the very few to ever really focus on educating Americans about the significant role that France played in our American Revolution. And just at the outset, I want to give a shout out to my colleagues who have been involved historically and working in the trenches to really work on the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Trail, which we commonly refer to as W3R. But there's Ellen von Karajan, there's Kim Burdick, there's Dr. Bob Seelig, Iris DeRode has come aboard to talk about French activity. Donna Passmore and Jan Smoltzer have been really, really involved in developing a wonderful book about the route. And of course, Dr. Larry Ferrara has been involved in the French and the Spanish involvement. So I want to thank them. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of some of the people that are involved. I know Chuck Schwam and others have been involved in various organizations focusing on the French role. And I want to, I'm sorry if I missed anybody, but just wanted to talk to some of the people that I've been working with lately. In any event, it's important to understand from the outset of this presentation that it's generally prepared for an American audience that has little knowledge or awareness of what actually happened in our American Revolution, in our American history in general. We have strong tendency in the United States in our history books to perpetuate myths that hide our true patriotic past and ignore the real contributions of France and Spain in helping us acquire our American independence. Now, in part one, we talked about why Saratoga was not the turning point of the American Revolution. And we alluded to, the myth that Ben Franklin went over to France, wooed the women, wooed everybody, including the king, but they were reluctant to get involved until all of a sudden, magically, the Battle of Saratoga occurred, and France then began to jump in with both feet. And neither of those situations is true. We debunked that myth in the first. And so what we're going to talk about today is who really laid the foundation for French involvement, literally a year or more before Saratoga, and the key players that nobody knows about, and few really know the circumstances with which France didn't get involved. So let's key up our PowerPoint here. We share screen. All right. Okay, we'll go to the beginning. All right, can people see that screen? We're good to go? Okay. Well, French aid during the American Revolution, Part 2, the key players. There's a picture of an older Louis XVI, but he was about 16, or actually 19 when he became king. His father had died, and so he inherited the monarchy from his grandfather, Louis the 15th. All right, and that's a map of France, certainly before the or for the Revolution, really. And so let's move into it here. So today we're really going to talk about why Louis the 16th supported the American cause. You know, what motivated him to do it, to identify the key players who made it happen, and to really overall to understand the American Revolution and the role that France played. We've got to talk about the types of aid that were provided and how it really helped us, we Americans, win our war for independence against Great Britain and break away as 13 colonies to eventually form the United States of America. Now, I just want to inject one thing here. We talk about July 4th being our Independence Day, which it is, but it is not the birth date of the United States of America. None of the 13 colonies were looking at themselves as the United States as we know it today. They were looking upon themselves as 13 separate nation states who were loosely bound together by a confederation of nation states to try to break away from Great Britain. And that is cited simply in our Articles of Confederation that we use as our first constitution before the United States Constitution united us in 1789. So, why did France help the English colonies? Well, there are two major reasons. Some people did have an interest in the American colonies, and of course, Lafayette was one of those that really became committed to American independence, and he just fell in love with America. But there's two major reasons that France got involved at the outset. One was simply revenge against Great Britain. If you look at this map, you see that almost all of North America was controlled before 1754 by France. England had just a small area along the eastern seaboard, which is the current 13 colonies, the current United States, and then up around the Hudson's Bay area. But the interesting thing about it, at Hudson's Bay, there were no British that were up there. There were French traders, there were Native Americans, there were some Dutch traders, but the British might have claimed that area, but there really were not any British up there. And so I don't even know why they continue to show that map. I guess it's because it's claimed by Great Britain. But the bottom line is that the French and Indian War in America, or the 7 Years' War, as it's known in Europe, really was devastating for France. France was defeated and humiliated in both Europe and over here. And as a result, in 1763, all of that land that France had possessed over here in North America really went to Great Britain. There was a section we call Louisiana today that Spain was able to obtain when France ceded that land to Spain, basically for helping them during that war. Now, the second reason, so revenge against Great Britain was the real primary reason that drove uh, France to help the American colonies. The second reason was, if you look at all those colonies on the eastern seaboard, you're going to find out that they, like colonies of nations all around the world, are providing valuable raw materials and products that can be used by those countries. And so we had navigation acts that the British Parliament enacted that were applicable to our colonies. And quite simply, we couldn't trade with any other nation in the world. We had to, everything had to be approved by Great Britain. Goods had to be sold basically to individuals that were basically tied in with the British mercantile system. All the products had to be shipped on British ships, crewed by British crews. And for example, we could not trade, our colonies could not trade directly with France or Spain or the Dutch Republic or any country for that matter, without the British basically being very, very carefully guarding what we were doing in our trade policies. And of course, that led to smuggling. And much of the American Revolution, in my opinion, resulted as a fact that Britain started to crack down on our smuggling. They looked the other way when they didn't need revenue, but when they were losing revenue and in fact needed revenue to help pay for that expensive French and Indian War in America, then they began to crack down on our smuggling. And that really, really upset all the colonists, because many of the merchants were deeply into smuggling, John Hancock in particular, but there were many, many more. So you have those two factors there to develop ties. I mean, France wanted to trade with the nation state of Virginia. They wanted to trade with the nation state of New York. They wanted to trade with the nation state of South Carolina. They knew they weren't trading with one nation of 13 separate little states. They knew they had an opportunity, if they could break these colonies away from Great Britain, then that would be 13 new golden opportunities of economic trading that they could achieve by doing that. So, uh, basically, what was happening is that France was quietly under the direction initially of Louis XV and then later Louis XVI to rebuild their army and their navy. A gentleman that we'll hear about later in perhaps a future talk is a gentleman by the name of Rochambeau, was given the primary responsibility of rebuilding the army and the navy quietly, low key, behind the scenes, so that England would not find out what was going on. And the minister at the time in France was Comte de Vergennes. He really was looking for a way to support the colonies in breaking away, but he was very cautious in doing so. The king was also very cautious. Louis wasn't any dummy. He was very, very bright, but he was very cautious. And he knew as a young monarch at age 19 or 20 that he didn't want to take on at that time a major foe who was fully prepared to squash any attempts that France had at trying to get back on the world scene militarily. So the French government really isn't prepared for war just yet. They're still working on laying the foundation for that. So Vergennes needed to find out what was really going on in the colonies, and he sent some people over here. But I just want to make a comment about Vergennes. He was a brilliant French diplomat. He was very seasoned, very experienced. He was born in 1717, and he served as a French minister during the reign of Louis XVI. And he eventually was really the person who drove the king towards supporting our aid. And he was actually a prime minister of the French Republic from 1781 to 1787. And so he was a very, very effective diplomat, and he was very effective in negotiating the treaty at the end of the war as well. So he's in a position where he wants to find out what's going on. We're not going to commit our resources to these colonies unless we find out if there's a real grudge. We don't want them making up if they have a dispute or somewhat rebellious nature against their mother country, Great Britain. We don't want to inject ourselves into something where they're going to patch their relationship up and then we're hung out to dry. So he was really concerned about that. So what he did is he sent some spies over here to hang out. Where else? In the Continental Congress, in the halls of Congress, where they could eavesdrop on the conversations that were going on. And what he found out is that we were very, very sore about this proclamation of 1763, which limited our westward expansion from the Appalachians all the way to the Mississippi. That was one of the reasons why we supported Britain as colonies in the French and Indian War in America, because we had a hunger for the land to the west, the rich, fertile valleys in the Ohio region. And we felt that if we could help move the French out of that area as Englishmen, then in fact we would gain access to that area. But then the British Parliament, after the Treaty of 1763, the Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War in America, the 7 Years' War in Europe, basically passed this proclamation that said if you go across the mountains, you have to move back, which infuriated the colonists. Many of them, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, Patrick Henry, all began to purchase land over in the Ohio Valley from Indians, some of which legally, others of which illegally. But the point being is we began to settle there. And that made us very angry when they said we'd have to move back. Then they also extended as kind of a last ditch effort to keep us from moving across the mountains. British government, under which Quebec was under the control, and actually the British decided to leave Quebec as a French governing province. They decided to basically extend the boundaries of Quebec that you see in the dark blue there, all the way down into the Ohio Valley, which further infuriated us because bear in mind, all these British colonies, these English colonies, are Protestant. And they were basically saying to us, if you want to go across the mountain in spite of that proclamation that defies you from, or basically says that you cannot do it, if you go across the mountains into that area, then what you're doing is you're going to be subject to French courts. And if you violate any laws, the French are going to take care of you and not the British. And that was like a finger in the eye to a lot of the British colonists. And of course, there were certain taxation and regulatory measures imposed without the consent of the colonial assemblies. And of course, once again, we bring up the word smuggling. That was a major factor. Well, these spies basically gathered some pretty good information, and they said there was reason to do something. So Vergennes heard the report, and he sent a French envoy, Mr. Bonvier, to come over here and actually see if he couldn't seek out some of the leaders of the rebellion. So when we were meeting in the Continental Congress with Carpenters Hall in Philadelphia in late 1775, he met with Ben Franklin and he met with John Jay and he had an interpreter there. And he basically said, I'm not going to tell you anything about the nation that might be interested, and you may know who that is, but what would happen if a nation could provide you with arms, ammunition, tents, uniforms, money, support that you might need to break away as colonies from Great Britain? Would that be of interest to you? And of course, they resoundingly said yes. So Bonvoyer went back to France and told Vergennes, he said, this is really, really serious, and they're going to be making some moves shortly. And of course, already by that time, there had been Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Breed's Hill, commonly referred to as Bunker Hill, and some other engagements as well. So what was happening is that a gentleman by the name of Pierre Augustin Caron Beaumarchais worked to basically set up a Rodrigo Hortalis company, which was created in May of 1776. This is months before our Declaration of Independence. And the whole idea was to send those arms and ammunition and tents and uniforms and money over here because there were a lot of these items that were stored in warehouses that were left over from the 7 Years' War, and that it was available because if you're rebuilding an army, you're rebuilding your navy, you're going to want to have new uniforms, you're going to want to have new weaponry, you're going to have the latest in technology to become a strong nation militarily again. So some of this largesse was basically expendable, and it was basically government surplus. And so Beaumarchais came up with the idea of beginning to quietly, low key behind the scenes, begin to send this material over here to the Americans to smuggle it in. The deal they made was that we were going to send them rice and indigo from the Carolinas, tobacco from Virginia, and lumber from New England. The trouble is that by the time the British fleet came over here to patrol the waters along the coasts of the colonies, they eventually shut down the ports in the South, Wilmington, Savannah, and Charleston, so we couldn't smuggle out our indigo and rice. They couldn't smuggle in their arms. By the same token, they had the ports pretty well guarded in the north, and the only thing that we could really pay the French with eventually was tobacco. And of course, that's when they came in to the Chesapeake Bay, to the #1 tobacco port in America, Yorktown. And this is way before 1781. But despite the fact they were sending all this material to us, and lots of it, 90% of the arms that were sent to Saratoga that were used by soldiers, our American soldiers at Saratoga, was French made. Most of them were Charlevilles. Now, but they didn't send French troops. They didn't send French troops. Well, Beaumarchais is really the key person there. He's the key player. Well, who was Beaumarchais? Well, he was born in 1732, the same year as George Washington, actually. So they were the same age. He came from a watchmaking family, and he was an inventor by trade. But he was also a playwright and magician. He wrote The Marriage of Figaro, The Barber of Seville, and The Guilty Mother. He was also a diplomat and a spy, a publisher and a satirist. Also, he was an arms dealer and basically a financier and a revolutionary as well. So what he did is he basically had suggested to the king that if we can provide these arms and ammunition and supplies to the Americans, that will, while we're still rebuilding our army and navy, that'll better position the colonies to help break away. And then when we're ready, perhaps we can commit troops. And basically the king committed 8.5 million in today's dollars. He went to King Charles, another Bourbon, from the Bourbon family dynasty, and he committed 8.5 million. And then Beaumarchais went to the merchants in France and said, you all were going to make out very well with this deal, this arrangement, and smuggling our goods to America and them smuggling out to us goods that we need. And so he was able to get about 8.5 million from the private sector as well. So he did use that money to go buy the supplies from the armories and warehouses throughout France. Now, interestingly enough, in 1763, when the Treaty of Paris was signed to end the 7 Years' War and also the French and Indian War in America, one of the people who was a member of the spy ring, you might say, of Louis XV and then later Louis XVI was the Chevalier Dion. and he was over there and was negotiating points of the treaty of 1763. And interestingly enough, while he was an interim ambassador to London during that time period, he was able to gather information about a potential French invasion because Louis XV, even though he was defeated, was beginning to have second thoughts and maybe launch an offensive against England. And so the Chevalier was there, and he was able to gather this information, and he used it as leverage against the king. When the king backpedaled and decided maybe we shouldn't do this, all that information was still there, and the Chevalier was in a position to use that as leverage. To see if he couldn't get a better deal. He wanted more money for it to spend. He wanted more clothing. He wanted all kinds of luxuries. And so he was basically blackmailing the king. And Beaumarchais was given a unique request from the king. We can't, this was the new king, Louis XVI. He was concerned that, this is getting beyond control and we got to do something about this. So Beaumarchais was able to work something out with the Chevalier Dion concerning the information, and they were able to cut a deal basically where Dion would come back to France because obviously he was on the outs with the king when he was in England, threatening to expose what France had previously wanted to do. Now, who is this Chevalier Dion? He was born in 1728. He was a French diplomat, a spy. He joined the king's special network of spies in 1756. He was a captain of dragoons and a very good swordsman, by the way, in 1761, and he fought at the Battle of Billinghausen in the 7 Years' War. And that's when he was sent after that war to draft this peace treaty ending the 7 Years' War, and where he learned of the intrigue of a possible invasion of England. He was awarded the Order of St. Louis and knighted as a Chevalier in 1763. Now, the interesting thing about it, he's a little interesting there. There's a poster of him on the right, that picture, and he appeared for 50 years. He dressed as a man, and then he lived for 33 years as a woman. I'm not going to get into the details, but there are some books on it that I can reference you at the end of this. But he was quite a character, and he, in fact, was like a middleman, and he enabled Beaumarchais to bring pressure on the king to say, if I can get this information from Dion, will you then support troops to the Americas? So Lafayette was a very young man at Metz, the training academy there, and he was in the command of a regiment that was commanded by Charles Francais, the Comte de Broglie. And Broglie was a student of military affairs, very brilliant person, and he also knew something about the war in America. And Lafayette was just enamored. He was very, very interested in, he had heard about George Washington. He thought it was a noble cause for the Americans to try to gain their independence and freedom from Great Britain. And he was trying to figure out how he could get involved. And the Comte de Broglie basically gave him some advice and as to how to navigate that. So I thought that was pretty interesting that he sought the advice of his commander, and the commander was very amenable to pointing him in the right direction, because Broglie knew a gentleman by the name of Silas Dean. Now, long before Ben Franklin came over to France in December of 1775, Silas Dean, an attorney from Connecticut, came over. And that's when he met Beaumarchais. Now, Silas Dean was born in Groton, Connecticut in 1737. He was the son of a blacksmith. He was a graduate of Yale College. He was a Connecticut attorney. He was actually a founder of the American Navy. He was in the Connecticut General Assembly. He was a very good diplomat, and Ben Franklin actually sent him over to France to begin the process of working with anybody. And it was Silas Dean who came over to France and began actually working with Beaumarchais. It was Silas Dean, by the way, who brought over Lafayette to America. It was Silas Dean who brought the Baron de Kalb, Tadeusz Kościuszko, and a number of other people that came over to serve in the American Revolution. It was not Ben Franklin who brought them over. It was Silas Dean. And in fact, a lot of French officers were looking to get involved in the American Revolution, and he had to actually promise them some commissions. And when they came over here, Congress was pretty upset because he was sending people left and right over here to serve in the military, and it got a little out of hand. But to say the least, Dean was a very, very key player. And in fact, Lafayette met with him through Baron de Kalb, who was I'd say, a close mentor of Lafayette's. Now, Louis XVI was really upset with the fact that Lafayette wanted to go to America. He knew that Lafayette was very wealthy. Came from a great family. He married into a very good family, the Noels, and he felt that if Lafayette came over here and for any reason was killed in the American Revolution battles or something, that might, that would be bad for France until they were actually ready to engage militarily. But Lafayette came anyway. He was able to bring some officers with him. And of course, he fell in love with America, and we fell in love with him. Interestingly enough, the king told him that he said, I don't want to hear any more of you going to America. And he told him he had to be confined to his palace grounds. And, Lafayette's 19 years of age. If you're 19 years of age, you got all the money in the world, and your king tells you you're not going to go to America, what are you going to do? He obviously went to America. So, Dean was over there for a good 5 or 6 months in France, working closely with Beaumarchais and lining up arms, ammunition, tents, uniforms, that type of thing, and doing a good job of it. And in fact, Ben Franklin was sent over there months later in December of 1776, along with Arthur Lee. Now, Franklin did get along with Dean very well. He's the guy who suggested Dean go over there and lay the foundation, the groundwork for working with France. But as it turns out, they got along famously, but Arthur Lee was very jealous of the relationship between Dean and Franklin. In fact, he had come directly from England, and his family, the famous Lee family of Virginia, had deep, deep ties financially and trade-wise with England. So it's a question in my mind as to whether or not he was actually committed to helping the American cause of liberty, even though his brother, Richard Henry Lee, did get the resolution passed of independence in the Virginia General Assembly and was the first to introduce that in the Continental Congress. But Arthur Lee, I think, had his own designs in what was going on and really did everything he could to undermine Dean. In fact, he eventually was able, because of his friends in the Continental Congress, primarily the Lee family and the Adams family, was able to get Dean recalled. Interestingly enough, he then turned his attack on Benjamin Franklin to try to get Franklin recalled. Well, Franklin was just simply too popular with the king and the court. And in fact, he turned the tables on Arthur Lee and got Arthur Lee recalled. So that puts Ben Franklin in the spotlight in France all by himself. And that's where most of our history books in America begin, with Ben Franklin's effort of working with France to get French aid. But as you can see, all the heavy lifting was done by Dean, and a lot of the background, all the activity was going on before Franklin even arrived. Now, interestingly enough, the first ship that came over that had lots of cargo was the Mecure, and it arrived at the port of Marseille, and it had 12,000 muskets. At the time, George Washington maybe had 14 or 15,000 troops, so there's 12,000 French muskets right there. And of course, Washington's numbers in his Continental Army varied from year to year, month to month, simply because of desertions and then new recruits and that type of thing. So it was very fluid for most of the war. But as you can see, the contents of one ship contained an awful lot of items that were being used by the Americans that they needed. We didn't have any armories over here to produce weaponry. We didn't have the factories that could mass produce uniforms. If British uniforms were captured, then they were dyed a dark color as opposed to wear red uniforms. So, and they ended up usually when you mix red with blue, it ends up being a brown color. So you put indigo in it and it becomes a brown color. So many of the Continental uniforms of the Americans were brown. So the French did provide a tremendous amount of technical assistance and French aid. We didn't have a school of cavalry to teach our cavalry leaders how to do battle on horseback. We didn't have an artillery school. We didn't have how do you transport hundreds of troops across rivers and streams and harbors and cut your way through forests to create roads without engineering skills. So Louis Lebec Deportes was a brilliant engineer who came over here and enlisted in the American Army for that purpose. We didn't have a military academy to train our militias and turn them into continental troops, very well disciplined to be able to fight toe to toe with the British professional soldiers. Baron Steuben came over here, courtesy of Beaumarchais and Silas Dean. Also, of course, we had the brilliant Baron de Kalb. Not to mention the fact that overall, we estimate that France perhaps gave, it could be more, could be a little less, but I think it's around $29 billion in today's 2020, 2021 dollars. That's the amount of aid that they gave us there. Now, as we begin to go to the finish line here, France had two major requirements before committing French troops. Obviously, they were providing us with arms, ammunition, tents, uniforms, money, technical assistance, that type of thing. But before they committed troops, they wanted proof that we were going to break away. They had to see a copy of our Declaration of Independence. They wanted to make sure that we were very determined to break away and that we were going to break away. So we had to give them a copy of our Declaration of Independence, and that occurred. Also, they wanted to know whether we could win a battle on our own. Can you win a battle, Americans? Are we going to fight your war for you or fight your war with you? And so the battle at Saratoga was decisive in the sense that we showed that we could defeat a British army. And that's when the French committed troops. It's not when they committed, themselves. They had jumped in with both feet to support the American cause long before Saratoga. So that's the problem with American history books. They all pinpoint Saratoga as the turning point. It was not. We did not win a single battle in America after Saratoga for 35 months. And I drilled that point home in our first talk. And in the third and final part, we'll talk about the battles that the French were involved with. So Franklin and Dean, because of Saratoga, they were able to negotiate this formal treaty of amity and commerce that said the French would, in fact, come to our defense and help us. And of course, we had favorable trade relations as well. And there you see the postage stamp from the bicentennial of Franklin presenting that treaty to the king, or vice versa. And there, of course, in the panel on the left, you see the king signing it with Ben Franklin in the foreground, with Silas Dean and Arthur Lee in the background. So, what did we learn today? Well, there are two major reasons, really, that France supported the American cause from the outset: revenge and trade. And then later, of course, there were people like Lafayette and others who came over who really fell in love with the American cause and really became enraptured with what was going on, and they became staunch allies of ours when that occurred. The key players who really orchestrated the French involvement for the American cause were first and foremost Comte de Vergennes. He saw the vision of wanting to get France back on top militarily as a military power in Europe and throughout the world. Beaumarchais, who few people have ever heard of, nobody in America knows who he is. Silas Dean, who nobody in America knows who he is, much less France. The Chevalier Dion, and he was obviously caught up in being a very good spy and gathering information, but also somewhat pressuring the king through the intrigue that he was weaving, that web that Beaumarchais was able to work with Dion, and as a result used that as pressure to get the king to commit troops. And of course the Marquis de Lafayette, because later on when France was actually thinking of pulling the plug, because Americans were losing in 1779, and France was reconsidering since things had not gone well with the first French troops that came over with Comte d'Estaing. France was actually thinking of pulling the plug and backing away, and it was Lafayette, thanks to Lafayette, convincing the king that this was not a lost cause, that please reconsider. And that's when the second French army, the successful French army of Rochambeau, came over here. The dummy trading company, Rodrigo Hortalis, that was created by Beaumarchais, that was really the lightning rod that was used to smuggle arms to America. And in return, we could smuggle whatever we could to France, and it ended up being tobacco, really. Silas Dean was the first American envoy to really work with Beaumarchais. He's the guy who brought Lafayette, de Kalb, von Steuben, and the other officers over here. It was not Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin contributed, but Silas Dean was the person who made the first initial contact. French aid arrived in all kinds of forms: arms, ammunition, tents, uniforms, money, cavalry officers, expertise, engineers, and the use of French seaports. I didn't mention that. They allowed all of their ports, their seaports, to be used by American privateers such as John Paul Jones to attack the British shipping. the supply ships that were coming over to America. And when Jones did that, he would, of course, capture those vessels, bring them over to French seaports, transfer the arms and ammunition that he would capture to French ships that would then come to America and deliver them to the American troops in George Washington's army. And then, of course, if there was non-military items, he would just simply give them to the French people. The Declaration of Independence and the American victory at Saratoga really helped convince France to commit French troops. That was it. They were holding off on troops until Saratoga. So Saratoga was key in committing the troops. It wasn't key in getting French involved. It was in getting French troops to fight alongside our troops. And finally, the American colonies could have never gained their independence without the support of France. That's just a fact. There's just simply, when you look at the numbers, when you look at the amount of the French support that we received, 13 colonies could not have done it on their own, because we weren't really united. We were only a confederation of sorts, of various regiments from various states or various colonies. So the next time, we'll discuss what happened really when the French troops were sent to America to assist Washington and the Continental Army. What role did they play? Who were the leaders in that capacity? We'll also talk about the problems that the French had in working with the American commanders. We were not an easy crowd to work with, and perhaps we felt the same way about them. We'll also talk about the key battles involving both the French and the American troops, and we'll talk about a particular emphasis really on the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Trail and the siege of Yorktown. Yorktown was not the last battle of the American Revolution. It was the last major battle, but it wasn't the last battle. Skirmishes continued throughout the South in particular on up until 1783. In fact, Charleston was finally evacuated by the British in December 1782. They evacuated New York City in September of 1783. So, if you're interested in learning more, I could not recommend a better book than Unlikely Allies by Joel Richard Paul. And it talks about Dion, it talks about Dean, and it talks about the Beaumarchais and how they all wove that intrigue together to really were the players behind the scenes that really got France into the American cause of liberty. So for further information, I'm available, as is Robert Sharetta. There's our address and contact information. And this really concludes the second presentation. I want to thank Denny and our viewers for your interest and attention. And at an appropriate time, I'd like to offer a toast.
Let's do a toast, yeah.
Okay. All right, there we go. All right, we'll get out of that.
Can you close your screen so we can see everybody on the screen?
Okay, let me see.
Your share screen. Oh, I can actually probably do it.
Yeah, you can do it on your end, I think. There we go.
Let's see.
There you go.
There you
Absolutely.
go. Okay, very good. So,
well, my toast.
And we have some questions after that, but I think a toast is appropriate first.
Absolutely. Okay. And this toast is to all the French patriots who no one knows, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to help 13 original nation states become the United States of America. May we never forget the bonds that brought France and the United States together, and those who made it happen. Vive la France.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. That was a great presentation and a great toast for a great cause, I guess. So thank you very much. I do have some. Several people have asked questions during your presentation, so I'm going to ask them for them, so it'll be easier. So the first question is from Ken. Ken is asking, he recently read a reference that Rodrigue Hortalez and Company was created shortly after Lexington Concord. Are you saying its creation was later?
Beaumarchais started to think about this after Lexington and Concord, but it was really, I think, in May of 1776 that he was able to finally get things moving. He actually was pulling the elements together after he was able to get the money from Louis XVI. And they had actually tried to send, they had loaded up several ships and they were going to send them in 1775. But there was a delay and they could not send them until a little bit later. And it was just a lot of red tape. I'll go back and double check the dates, but Beaumarchais just didn't all of a sudden wake up and do this. He had been involved for well over a year before our declaration, trying to work with hand in glove with Vergennes to try to line up this support. He was fearful that once the war began, that the British would crush the Americans, and he thought it was just a necessity to get it, at the very least, arms, ammunition, those types of things into the hands of the Americans to give them a fighting chance, because we really didn't have a disciplined army. They weren't trained. The formal training occurred, I guess you can say, at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777-78. And then, of course, shortly thereafter, there was the Battle of Monmouth, which was the last major engagement of the American army in the north before the British shifted their attention to the south, because they were spinning their wheels. They weren't bringing the war to a close. And then, based upon assurances from the royal governors in the colonies in the Carolinas, they were persuaded. Saint Germain in Great Britain was persuaded to shift the attention to the south, where they thought they had a better chance to hold on to the colonies and maybe achieve victory. So that's when they came south. They captured Savannah in the tail end of 1778, and then of course they moved in 1779, and then they moved to Charleston in April and May of 1780.
All right. So our next question is from. Let's see. We have a lot of questions. Coming out. Next question is from Guillaume, good friend of mine. How much did Great Britain know about France's secretive help to Americans, and what did they do about it?
That's a great question. Thank you for that great question. They knew everything that was going on. The secretary, Edward Bancroft, that was the secretary to Arthur Lee, Ben Franklin, and Silas Dean, who signed on to be their secretary and write all their correspondence, was actually also on the payroll of Great Britain and Minister Stormont in London. So he would leave messages out in a jar across the street from where the three ambassadors were staying in France, and they would be picked up by another spy and taken back to Great Britain. But Britain, I think they were in a situation where they knew what was going on. They knew that France was rebuilding its navy and army, but they were hopeful that the French would not get involved. They were so preoccupied. I think they were really preoccupied with their possessions around the world, but they knew what was going on. They were not dumb. There were spies everywhere. As I said, Dion was a spy over in England for many years, and Beaumarchais began as a spy. So Louis XV had a tremendous network, tremendous spy ring in around Europe, and he was very, very good at that. And I think a lot of that was continued also by Louis XVI. All these nations were dependent upon spies for intelligence and information gathering to help them make good policy decisions that were in their best interest. So it was Britain did know about this that was going on.
And Joyce is it's not a question. I think it's just to add to this. She says at the beginning that is why they were suspicious of Lafayette at first. I think that's related to that Joyce is making that comment.
Well, I think so. Let me just add something to that. Lafayette had some strong ties to a number of people over there, and a lot of I've read this in a lot of areas and spoke to a lot of people. I mean, we adore Lafayette, and rightly so, because he really was committed to the American cause. But I know there were some French officers, we've read where there's some French officers that were somewhat jealous of him because he was, I guess they looked upon him as an upstart because he was able to position himself when he came over, and the Congress didn't want him. He had to persuade the Congress that he could bring his own money, he could bring his own aides. They didn't have to pay anything, so they basically recognized who he was as a very wealthy Frenchman who was tied to the king. And so they assigned to George Washington's staff, And the thing of it is that Washington didn't know what to do with him. Washington didn't want to get him killed. He didn't want to put him out there in front of troops, even though Lafayette was eager and very experienced, by the way, to lead troops. Nevertheless, Washington kind of took him under his wing and you might say treated him as a son. And Washington was very cautious about that. But I think that some people, I think some of the French officers may have resented Lafayette because he really was committed to the cause. In fact, when he went after the war was over and he returns to France, he had been away so long that the king, Louis XVI, made him basically the head of the National Guard, which I guess I'd have to defer to some of my French historian colleagues to determine whether or not the National Guard would be considered to be a high-level secret service or not. But the fact is that he brought these feelings of liberty back to France. But yet, I personally think, and I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary, that I think he was kind of out of touch with the groundswell that was going on of the conspirators with Robespierre and others that were conspiring against the monarchy. And of course, he fell out of favor with them, and was after the king, I think, was and Marie Antoinette were captured during the Revolution. He was on the border, and they were beckoning him back to Paris. And he knew that if he went back to Paris, he might lose his head, because some of these officers had served, the French officers who had served in the American Revolution, didn't last. Comte d'Estaing was one. He was executed. Rochambeau, fortunately, was not executed, thankfully. But there were a number of them who were. So Lafayette was adored by those of us in America then and today. But I'm not so sure that some of the officers with whom he served felt the same way.
All right. We have a question from Mo. I think Mo is a member of the Alliance Française in Detroit. So, we have people from all over here tonight. Mo says, great presentation. Of course, I agree. Could you please tell us about the contribution of the French Navy in battles against the English Navy?
Well, that's part 3. That's suffice it to say, I'll defer that until the part 3. That's what I'm going to be talking about. I'll be talking about the major engagements of the French and the British navies. They were, suffice it to say for now, it was crucial. And what was really crucial, and I'll just tip my hand on this, what was really crucial was the alliance between France and Spain, because their combined navies were quite a match for the British Royal Navy. And if had that not occurred, I don't know how it would have ended up with the battles. But there were naval battles that were won by the French that were significant, very significant, in terms of the impact that it had on our American independence. But I'll be talking about all those battles in part 3 of French involvement in the American Revolution.
All right, so register for part 3. We don't have a link yet, but be ready for it. Brian is asking, says, hi, I read that Beaumarchais had trouble getting some ships carrying military supplies to the colonies past the British ships. Can you talk about this?
Yes, that was a common threat and always a high risk, because the British were obviously patrolling anything and everything that came out of France. But there's only so many British ships, so a lot of the French ships were able to slip through. I also think that Beaumarchais realized that, particularly when the war shifted to the south, and we're talking about early French involvement of getting goods into a lot of the ports up and down the eastern seaboard. But by 1779, 1780, the British had locked down Savannah, Wilmington, and Charleston, and of course the northern ports, New York being a major port. And Yorktown was at that time the largest tobacco port in America. And if you look at a map of the eastern United States, you can see that the French could very easily slip into Chesapeake Bay, go up the York River, go up the James River, and what's located along the riverbanks? Tobacco plantations. What's outside the plantation house? Warehouses filled with tobacco. So while the French are dropping off their goods, desperately needed goods, and loaded on wagons to be taken south to provide the partisans in the Continental Army with goods that they need to fight the battles in the south, they're taking back tobacco. in these hogsheads, these huge barrels, and of course the James River and the York River are both York River in particular is a deep water channel, and so there you have an opportunity for us to pay the French in some small way for what they were providing us, and that's tobacco. And so they could slip in the Chesapeake Bay. You look at a map, you can slip in and slip out. It's a pretty big bay, and the British simply did not routinely patrol that far south unless they were supply ships that were taking goods down to Charleston, Wilmington, or Savannah. And as a result, I mean, they were just spread too thin. The British, by the time the Spanish got involved, the British had to protect their colonies and their interests in India and throughout the world. So they're really deploying their troops in a broad sense throughout the world to protect their interests. So it was tough. Beaumarchais did try to get through. I suspect I don't have an exact count. I'd have to talk to Larry Ferrara and some of my other colleagues to find an exact count of how many of Beaumarchais' ships were in fact confiscated or captured by the British. But the French did not stop. They were just relentless in their ability to try to get the goods to the Americans.
All right.
Great question, by the way. Great question.
Peter is asking, why was the British blockade ineffective in preventing smuggled French aid?
They were spread too thin. It's as simple as that. Their priorities were the key ports of New York, Charleston. They were the two major ports, and then you have Savannah, you have Wilmington, and you have Boston. They were there for a while, but then they left. They also were at Providence. So the British were. Then they started deploying their ships around the world to protect their possessions. So I think they were, quite frankly, just simply spread too thin. But Beaumarchais was successful. Maybe Providence helped him out, but it was really a unique ability for him to be able to get those ships over here. And they sent, I think they sent 8 ships the first year. And if you think about it, if you had an average of 12 to 15,000 muskets on one ship, just multiply that by 8. So we had lots of arms and ammunition coming over to this country. Not to mention uniforms and cloth for uniforms, and belt buckles and shoes and blankets and all those things that were necessary to outfit an army.
All right. Kim is, I don't think it's a question, but Kim, hi Kim, saying you may want to check with Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. Ralph Nelson may remember when Didier de Bonvouloir and his wife came to Philadelphia to help Charlie Cook make the film Tête à Tête.
Excellent. Excellent suggestion, Kim. Wonderful.
Yep. All right. Dennis is saying you should attend the virtual tour of the French Riviera and Monte Carlo next week, but that's let's
Send me the link. I'll be happy to.
Guillaume is asking, how significant was France's financial help compared to its economy? So not just how significant was it, but compared to its economy, how much of a sacrifice was it?
Absolutely. Well, as I recall, I think Louis XVI fired and replaced about 3 or 4 French ministers. A couple French ministers in the early going were saying, we have a tremendous debt left over from the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War in America, and we simply are not financially positioned to help the Americans. And when Louis finally made up his mind that he was going to support the Americans, I think he was going to do it at any cost because he had a lot at stake, and thank God he did. But a lot of people point to the fact, or they have a theory that the American Revolution broke France and forced them to have their French Revolution. I'm not so sure. There's a variety. There's a number of scholars who have differing views on that. But the French economy, I think, was relatively fragile to begin with. After you have any major war, unless you have a thriving economy and a rebuilding that erases that debt, you're going to have some serious problems. And France was not only rebuilding, but then they were draining themselves at the other end with what they had. Now, they had surplus, that's true, but I don't think the economy was on an even keel to begin with, probably going back to the French and Indian War, and that never really stabilized. And then I think as the war progressed and America began to gain its foothold and these colonies began to break away, I think that France was still in a unique situation where they never really fully recovered economically. Britain was also in a very difficult situation, but Britain bounced back pretty quickly. It took less than 10 years for Britain to stabilize their economy. They had this mercantile system that they still relied heavily on colonies to provide raw materials, and they would take those raw materials from the colonies and industrialize with the first factory of industrialization in Europe, and start to make take raw cherry trees and make the finest furniture in England of cherry, and then sell that or trade it or give it back to the nations that provided it. So they had a very, very vibrant mercantile system. And Alexander Hamilton, as our first Secretary of the Treasury, pointed that out as reasons for us to bolster our trade with Britain, because they were able to be debt free, literally, within 10 years after the American Revolution, where France was just getting into its own revolution, which had a lot to do with the debt. So the economy is always tied to a nation's policy, and sometimes it breaks in one way or the other. But France was definitely hurt with its continual financial support of the American colonies.
All right.
Good question. Good question.
Robert, your partner is it's a question, but I think it's somewhat of a political question that I probably would have I probably want to avoid answering myself. But for over 25 years in Washington, I've repeatedly heard French diplomats begin their speeches with great thanks to the U.S. for World War II. I have yet to hear a U.S. diplomat pay homage to France for our birth as a nation, and French diplomats avoid the discussion. Why is that?
That's anybody's guess. I think it.
Right.
I think maybe a lot of people simply don't know about our American Revolution. Would be my answer, because World War II, World War I are far more recent. We recognize that John J. Pershing sent the American Expeditionary Force at President Woodrow Wilson's behest over to help France free themselves from German army control, and then, of course, later free France from Nazi control in World War II. And if you think about it, those happened within the last 100 years. But quite frankly, most Americans simply don't know about our American Revolution. They have no clue of France's involvement. They may know of Lafayette, but they've never heard of Silas Dean or Beaumarchais, the wonderful things they did to line up support for France. They're just simply not attuned to what happened. So I would suspect that people in today's diplomatic corps have a pretty good understanding of American foreign policy and French foreign policy, based upon the fact that anyone today who you have to go back to the roots of our foreign policy really in the post-World War II era to have an appreciation for how things evolved with NATO and the relationship we've had with France ever since. But I wouldn't expect them to know the history of the American Revolution and France and Spain's role with us. So my answer to that would be simply, I think it's a lack of historical knowledge.
I mean, again, without getting too much into it, because that's not what I want to do. But while there's been, for the time I've been here, and it's been over 35 years, ups and downs. Certainly, the Iraq War and the Freedom Fries episode was a low. But overall, I've always had an extremely positive experience, with people who appreciate the fact that we, helped a lot, during your for the American Revolution. So, I certainly don't have an entirely negative experience, nor do I have even a negative experience. I have overall a positive experience. Now, if you had asked me the question in 2003, 2004, 2005, yeah, that would have been different, because, times were different. But overall, it was all in all, it's always been a positive experience. So,
right, I agree.
So Ken is saying, thank you so much. I think that's when you answer his question. Joyce, Joyce is saying, I once read that there was a plot to usurp, I think it's the way it's pronounced, usurp Washington by putting the Count de Broglie, I think we say de Broglie in French, but in his place as governor for France, and this was done by Vergennes and Beaumarchais.
Well, I, I can't speak to the Comte de Broglie, but he might have been interested in coming over here and heading up a French regiment or whatever. But Silas Dean did bring over Coudray, and Coudray came over here with the idea that he might be heading up as a French officer the American command, and of course that didn't work out. That infuriated um, the American officers who were under Washington. And of course, there was also a cabal, an attempt by certain officers within under Washington's command after he had lost multiple battles in New York to try to overthrow him as the commander in chief. And fortunately, that did not occur. Their conspiracy was discovered, and they all kind of faded away. But there might have been times that some of the French would have been involved or had visions of maybe leading American troops, but I don't think that was going to work. The interesting thing that I'll talk about at length in the next presentation is the relationship between Rochambeau and Washington, and I'll simply say this as a prelude to that: when you take all the officers of the American Army, the French Army, the British Army, the Spanish, you take them all, and none of them were as good as Rochambeau. Rochambeau was absolutely the best. He was the most knowledgeable, the most experienced, the most capable, and he knew how to work with Washington. He really was the savior, in my opinion, of the American Revolution with regard to France's involvement. He turned things around dramatically because of his ability, unique ability to gauge the situation and to give Washington the advice. It wasn't Washington's idea to go to Yorktown, it was Rochambeau's. And Rochambeau also had a wonderful relationship and worked for many years with the Comte de Grasse, who was the head of the French Navy. So their relationship in and of itself was really significant. And so we'll talk about that relationship and also the importance of the Washington Rochambeau revolutionary route as well in the next session. But yes, there were pangs of might have been some people. I haven't. I'll have to go back and do a little bit of research on the Comte de Broglie. I don't. I think it would have been somewhat presumptuous of him to think that he could replace George Washington, but Coudray definitely thought he could do that. But he was stopped dead in the water, and then he was drowned in the Schuylkill River outside of Philadelphia. So that kind of ended his designs on leadership.
Joyce added to her comment that Rochambeau was next in line for the guillotine, too.
Yeah, he was put in the what I think is the building in France called the Concierge. It's a huge building that was used.
Conciergerie.
Yeah, it was used as a huge prison, and he was there for several months, but then he was freed. And the interesting thing about it is that when Napoleon came to power, I think he was looking for ways to consolidate his power among French heroes. And Rochambeau certainly was a hero in France and probably adored by the French people. And I think Napoleon, probably did the right thing, because what he did is he conveyed, as I understand it, the first Legion of Honor on Rochambeau. Well, of course, that kept Rochambeau out of politics. He was never into politics anyway, but I think it was the right move on Napoleon's part when he was seeking to consolidate his power in the aftermath of the French Revolution. But Rochambeau, I'm sure, like a lot of people, but the whole monarchy and the aristocracy was on the line with the conspirators. I mean, they were, and they did get quite a few French officers. As I said, D'Estaing lost his head. I think Luzerne lost his as well. I mean, there's a number of them, and many members of Lafayette's family were guillotined as well. So there was a lot of bloodshed involved with the conspirators against monarchy, of course, itself, and of course with the the aristocracy, of which Rochambeau surely was one. But I think it's an instance where he was so well thought of as a military leader. And by the way, he gained his training from Marshal Saxe, one of the greatest French generals of all time, and certainly also from Frederick the Great. So he knew what he was doing. Few other leaders of the American Revolution on any side, on any from any nation, had the experience that Rochambeau had in warfare.
Judith from the FSCC Philadelphia is saying that it was a fascinating presentation. She saw she missed part one and would be interested in a repeat performance for the Philadelphia audience in July. So there you go. You may have
Okay.
got another gig. Thanks to Randy and for another excellent program. Looking forward to part three. Alan is asking, did France succeed in injecting its culture into the colonies with all this aid?
With all this, what?
With all this aid?
Um, I think so. I think Thomas Jefferson, in particular, was when he became president, was and of course as Secretary of State under General Washington, was very close. Having been ambassador to France, was very close to the French government, and really fell in love with French culture. And if you go to Monticello, you can see so many artifacts there that are of that he brought over from France. And he was really enamored with French wines, and he was really a Francophile to say the least. And I think he was such an influential person as they emerged as political parties that a lot of people, I think, identified with Jefferson then. A lot of people identify with him now. So I think that the answer is yes. I think that the French really did, through their aid, uh, really win over a lot of Americans. If you think about it, after Yorktown, Washington took his army back up north. Now, bear in mind, Yorktown was over in October. So where does he go? He goes north to the snow and ice because he was still obsessed with New York. He'd been humiliated in New York so many times when he was forced to withdraw there, and after fighting numerous battles that he lost in 1776. But he was so humiliated that he always wanted to go back to New York and take back New York from the British. And when Rochambeau came over here, Washington was giddy with enthusiasm because he thought he would finally have the troop numbers combined with the American numbers to take New York back. But Rochambeau wisely deferred. He demurred. He basically said, "No, I think we'll wait for a better time." And he was right in doing so because New York would have cost an awful lot of lives to attack and try to take back. But Washington was obsessed the entire war. If you look at the encampments that he had and the battles that he fought, they were all within striking distance of New York. He didn't come south, he stayed up there because he was obsessed with New York. And I think that has a lot to do with it. Just simply the fact that Rochambeau was able to convince him to come to Yorktown uh, under the guise of trapping Cornwallis, which would be a victory.
All right.
And, oh, by the way, let me just finish one other thing. As a result, when Washington took his army back up to New York, the French stayed here in Yorktown. They stayed here, and they spent their money, and they were treated. The Virginians loved the French, and very very pro French in this area. So the French army stayed in the colonies before they went back immediately. So for several months, I think French culture had a tremendous impact on the local communities.
Virginia is for Frenchies.
Yeah.
Ralph Nelson is saying, Bon Vouloir met with Franklin and Jay in Philadelphia in December of 1775.
Right.
That was just a comment. And Robert, your colleague, says a friend's estimate of 29 billion in aid to the colonies' effort is close to accurate. It represents a size that exceeded France's economy at the time.
Well, I'd have to compare some numbers. They're a little bit fluid, but our mutual friend, Dr. Larry Ferrara, has run some numbers on that, and he estimated that it was 29 billion. How that relates to the overall French economy, which would have been very fluid in terms of credit extended and actual money, I'd have to go back and run the numbers on that, but I'm sure they're available, and I will examine that.
So as I said, we have a lot of still a lot of messages to go through. I hope you still have time for us, and that maybe you have a snack next to you, or that you already eaten, but we still have a lot of little questions to go through. Kim is saying, just a comment, we actually started W3R when the French chapter of DAR, Daughter of American Revolutions, I think, visited Delaware, and it was decided we should build a Yorktown campaign route, Normandy Incursion Trail in France. And Robert, again, your colleague says the answer to his question, I think it was about the question about the diplomats, is that it is a consequence of history. Neither the offspring of the colonies, the USA, nor the French Republic had an interest in celebrating the French royalty for their contribution.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true.
And Judy is saying, concur with Randy that most Americans do not know about France's contribution to the American Revolution, but we are more savvy about it in Philadelphia, and Francophiles do know about it. There you go. Ralph is saying the U.S. Congress, I think, named the Washington Rochambeau out of National Historic Trail to recognize and thank France. Yep. Thank you.
Certainly, yeah.
And Joyce saying, so lucky to have someone like him and the experience that he had. I'm not sure. I'm not sure who she's talking about, if it's Lafayette or Rochambeau, or I think Rochambeau probably. And Joyce is adding, I know the Prince, gosh, I still have 17 questions to go through. I know the Prince de Broglie, and when I went to his chateau and he showed me the portrait of his ancestor, I said, oh, he was the bad guy in the American Revolution. He said, no, he was his brother. Don't tell that to others, maybe. Too late. Or maybe that's what he said to her. Okay. All right. Well, that's to Judy. I'll let Judy read that. Joyce saying, if you come to France, there is a fete every year at the Rochambeau Castle near Vendôme, right, usually July 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Joyce is also saying she belongs to a group, Les Amis de Rochambeau. Right. And Elliot is saying, Mount Vernon has always made big effort to honor France and teach about the role in helping Washington in winning.
Yes, that's very true.
So I think that's it. I actually went through all the comments. There was a lot of them. But that means it was a very interesting presentation. I certainly thought so. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Mo is saying, thank you for a great presentation. Looking forward to part 3. And thank you, Mo, for the nice words. Any parting word, Randy?
No, I thank you all for your attentiveness and for your interest in the relationship that France developed with the very young colonies to help us. If it had not been for France's involvement, there would be no United States today. It took us a while to get there. We had some growing pains after the American Revolution with our 13 nation states, which really did not have an interest in uniting as United States as we know it today. But like any new country, every something new always takes a little bit of growing pains, and we certainly experienced that. But if it had not been for France, we would not be where we are today. And I think that a lot of us are committed to in using the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route as a vehicle, among other things, to try to help educate Americans about the importance, the relationship that was established, and the importance role that France played is, I think, crucial to our American heritage, and for young people in particular to grow up and understand and appreciate things from a global perspective. We are not an isolationist country. We are an international country, and we work very closely with our allies in Europe and France is a major one. So I think that we have to look at things from a global perspective, that we're all a lot better because of the American-French relationship. And my hat's off to the French-American Chamber of Commerce for all that you all do to promote that educational effort. We're very, very pleased to be affiliated with you, and we look to working for a long relationship. Thank you very much, Denny, and thank all of you for your attentiveness today.
Well, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure working with you. It's a pleasure working with all the members, and I mean, you have tremendous knowledge of that history, and we're very grateful to you for presenting that to our members and our audience. Um, uh, so I think that should conclude this event. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, I did want to say. I know that some of you had some trouble, some of you had some trouble joining us at the beginning. So if you were not able to join right at the beginning and you think you missed something, feel free to send me an email and ask me for the recording. I will have the recording. It's probably within about half an hour, and either tonight or tomorrow morning, I will send you the link with the recording, and feel free to just don't re-record it for yourself, and also, do not distribute it. But other than that, feel free to, you know, or of course, if you'd like to listen to the presentation a second time as well, I will have the recording, and we'll send you the link. So again, thank you very much. I wish you a very nice evening, and hope to see you next week for next week is a presentation about Monaco and French Riviera, and coming soon as well, we're gonna have a presentation on, let me make sure I know what I'm talking about here, on the Eugène Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People. That's that's a famous painting, and it will be a presentation about this painting and its history and what's behind it and so forth. So again, thank you very much. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Some people say, please, please send me that by email. That would be a lot easier if you send me an email, because that chat is not. I'm not going to have access to that chat easily after that. So just send me an email if you want the recording. Thank you, Elliot. I'm saying that to Elliot and Patricia. They're asking me for the recording, but it would be better if you just send me an email. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Yep.
Thank you.